suffering from an eating disorder, a type of mental illness that left untreated can cause life-threatening mental and physical problems.
An eating disorder like anorexia, bulimia, or binge eating is one of the deadliest mental illnesses in the United States.
Nearly every hour in the U.S., someone dies due to complications related to an eating disorder.
But there is hope. Recovery is possible.
ANAD is here to help.
ANAD is a leading nonprofit in the U.S. that provides free peer support for anyone struggling with an eating disorder, regardless of age, race, gender identity, sexual orientation, or background.
Our nationwide network of volunteers understand firsthand the ups and downs of the recovery journey.
Because they too have lived the experience of an eating disorder.
ANAD empowers volunteers to help others through their own recovery.
Learn more at anad.org.
When patients first arrive here, they are often pretty anxious about food and what their diet's going to look like, and they meet with the dietitian on their first day to get a lay of the land of what our meal plans look like and what our menus have to offer. And so they are working with the dietitian to establish an initial meal plan, which is generally more or less like close to what they were eating prior to coming in, sometimes a bit more just to start facilitating more normalized eating. But our goal is to not overwhelm patients with food on their first day, so we try to make it as easy of a transition as possible. And by the time they leave here, our goal is for them to have much more flexibility with food, acceptance of a wider variety of foods, more acceptance of the nutrition that their body needs, and ability to go out to restaurants and eat in social settings and maybe cook and prepare food for themselves and just feed themselves in a sustainable way.
I think historically, eating disorder treatment centers haven't really integrated fitness into their treatment model. And I think that the one thing that I love about McCallum Place and the Victory program is that we do support safe and intentional integration of fitness into our program. A lot of our patients have struggled with kind of trauma around fitness and exercise or body shaming. So really being mindful of that and giving support to them is really important to me. I really want to create a safe and supportive environment that's non-judgmental so that they can come in and really work through the struggles that they have.
All of our therapists are trained in cognitive behavioral therapy and dialectical behavior therapy, so that's kind of the base for all of the treatment that we provide. And then each clinician has their own specialized training. So some are trained in EMDR, interpersonal neurobiology, somatic experiencing, dance movement therapy, music therapy, art therapies. We use a lot of expressive therapies here. And then they carry those modalities into the groups that they facilitate as well.
I feel honored to walk with individuals in our care kind of through treatment from the beginning stages and contemplating treatment and then seeing the healing and restoration that can and will occur with proper care.
When a patient comes in and they're struggling, and especially if they've had severe malnutrition or there's medical complications, we often talk about this in the group process, that it will appear as though there's nothing behind their eyes, that they are really a shell and very enmeshed with their eating disorder. And as they evolve and they abstain from behaviors, they start to come to life again and more of their personality starts to come through. They start to find their voice and re-engage with their community and their families and separate from their eating disorders.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the ANAD Virtual Conference 2020. We're delighted to have some incredible speakers here with us today for our very first webinar of our webinar series throughout every Wednesday this month in October. We're so grateful to our speakers. Next slide. And to our incredible sponsors and our exhibitors. Our lead sponsor is Rogers Behavioral Health, and we have a host of other great treatment centers who have offered their support in us putting this webinar series together. Be sure to check them out at our website to learn more about these treatment centers. And a special thanks to McCallum for the great video at the beginning of this presentation. A few housekeeping notes. We will be monitoring your questions throughout the webinar, so feel free to use the chat box to post some questions or some technical issues. If you're having them, we'll do our best to help with those. But if you have substantive questions about the presentation, feel free to chime in and list your question. The last portion of the webinar we will save for Q&A. So I'll be moderating a Q&A session, and then we will transition into the post-webinar small group discussions. And we'll post more information about the small group discussions in the chat function towards the end of our Q&A session. After this webinar, you'll receive 2 emails. This afternoon, you'll get the recording and a handout. Tomorrow from our CE provider, you'll receive a webinar evaluation. And then within 2 weeks, if you want a CE certificate, you will receive that within about 2 weeks. And finally, I'd like to introduce our speakers before I turn it over to them. I'm sure we're all excited to hear from them on this important topic. So just allow me to introduce them quickly, and then they will start their presentation. Dr. Lisa Erlinger is a clinical professor of family medicine at the University of Washington School of Medicine. She provides primary care focusing on larger bodied patients at the University of Washington Health Center and medical surveillance for the clients at Opal Food Plus Body Wisdom. She's a certified body trust provider and believes all patients deserve compassionate, weight-inclusive, trauma-informed, and gender-affirming medical care. Judith Matz is a therapist and nationally recognized speaker on the topics of diet culture, binge eating, emotional eating, body image, and weight stigma. She is co-author of the Diet Survivor's Handbook, Beyond a Shadow of a Doubt, the children's book, Amanda's Big Dream, and most recently, the Body Positivity Card Deck. Her work has been featured in the media, including NPR, New York Times, and Psychotherapy Networker. She has a private practice in Skokie, Illinois. And Aaron Flores has a private practice in Calabasas, California. He also works at Center for Discovery as Senior Coordinator for Weight Inclusive Care. He uses intuitive eating and health at every size in his work to help individuals learn how to make peace with food and their bodies. He is a certified body trust provider and also the co-host of the popular broadcast, Dietitians Unplugged. So as you can tell, all of these speakers have great expertise on this topic of weight stigma. We're really excited to hear from them. And again, we'll have some Q&A following the spoken portion of this presentation. So Lisa, I'll now turn it over to you. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. 1 second. Great. Well, it's such an incredible honor to be here this morning. I'm having a moment of just incredible gratitude. The 2 other speakers here today with me are people who have been so important in my own journey. And I'm really grateful for all of you taking the time to join us today, because I recognize that The issue of weight stigma in general, but particularly within the eating disorder community, is a really tender topic. We're all here because we want to help people with the ways in which they suffer under diet culture. And we are here under the mandate and the internalized value of doing no harm. So I want to hold gently the idea that I'm going to be suggesting that we might be doing unintentional harm, and that recognizing that is difficult. And I want to acknowledge that I have been personally part of that harm and part of a structure that promotes that harm in the medical field. I come to this topic from so many directions. I come personally as a woman living in a larger body who has weight cycled for much of my life, gaining and losing 25% of my body weight at times, never having anyone recognize that I had an eating disorder until it transitioned into a binge eating problem. And I am so grateful to my team, who I hope is here, for recognizing that I didn't have a binge eating problem. I had a restricting problem. And that issue of recognizing in larger bodied people the disorders that we so readily recognize in smaller bodied people, and how we may inadvertently harm those people in treatment, is really what I'm here for. I'm also here as a physician who for many, many years subscribed to the weight-centric paradigm. And even after I purportedly transitioned to supporting weight-inclusive care for my patients, behind the scenes, I was struggling with getting my own jeans on and worrying about my own weight and inadvertently restricting. And I know many of us find ourselves there. So again, tenderness there. I'm also here as a mother of 2 daughters, both with different weight trajectories, I have tried so hard to protect them from the harm that the community and the medical system may have purported. And lastly, I want to acknowledge that I stand on so many people's shoulders. I have privilege in speaking to you as a physician, training that I had access to because of my family's social standing and my place in this community. And the words I'm bringing to you are words that have been spoken by Black and Indigenous and gender nonconforming and disabled people for many, many years before me. And I hope that I'm giving honor to them by giving voice to them, but these are not my ideas. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. It's not progressing on my screen. Is it progressing for other people?
No, it's not, Lisa. My apologies. There we go. Okay.
Okay, great. Wonderful. Well, our goals for you are simple and so large. We hope that today you will come away with a broader idea of how weight stigma may play itself out inadvertently in our attempts to help people, and with at least a couple of ideas for how you personally may be able to make a difference, and also to encourage you to begin the conversation with the systems in which you work. I also recognize that there may be some patients or clients here as well. And to you, I say, this is not your fault. We have done harm, we are sorry, and we are trying. Next slide. So I want to talk about a few things before turning over the mic to the other fabulous speakers. I want to talk a little bit about the health effects of weight stigma and some of the roots of weight stigma. I want to debunk some of the myths around weight and health that I think play into why we perpetuate stigma. I'm going to talk about its impact, most importantly, on atypical anorexia, and maybe give you some tips about working with physicians. Next slide. Great. So I put up this kind of provocative photo here to give us a chance to confront some of our own weight bias. So we think about weight bias as negative weight-related attitudes towards individuals that are, quote, overweight or obese. And I include those words in this quote because they are verbatim, but also because I believe that those words themselves perpetuate weight bias. So they confirm the idea that there is a proper weight for an individual to be, and that you can therefore be above or below that weight. And if you get into a range that we consider unhealthy, we actually give that range a disease name called obesity. And previously we used to give a low body weight range a disease name called anorexia. Naming body size as a disease is in itself stigmatizing, but a lot of weight stigma comes not from the medical profession, it comes from our societal obsession with body size. And when health professionals are questioned about beliefs about different size bodies, physicians and dietitians have some of the highest levels of weight prejudice of any group measured within the country. And so we have to really look at our own feelings, and we've included in the after presentation information a link to test your own implicit bias about size. So this idea that larger bodied people are lazy, non-compliant, lacking in self-control, unsuccessful, dishonest, unintelligent, can affect the way we treat them within the treatment center. And the problem is that patients carry these ideas internalized too. They have internalized negative ideas about themselves because of their body size. When we inadvertently expose them to microaggressions within the treatment milieu, we reinforce those ideas and we reduce their opportunities for full recovery. I want to introduce an idea called stereotype threat, which was developed by Dr. Steele and Dr. Aronson. And stereotype threat is what they call a situational predicament, in that people, when reminded of how they embody a stigmatized identity, feel themselves to be at risk of conforming to those stereotypes and therefore are more likely to conform to those stereotypes. These studies have mostly been done around weight, around race and gender, but you'll see as I tell you about them how applicable it is to size in our treatment milieu. So, for example, there's a general idea that women and people of color are less competent at math. And if you give a math test to a group of people and you have the women dressed in swimsuits, they do much less well on their math tests. They also do less well if you introduce the test as something that can actually distinguish gender by performance. But if you introduce the test by saying that this particular test, even though it was just the same, actually is special because it is race and gender neutral, the people of color and the female identifying participants will actually do the same as the white men. So if we think about this within treatment, if we have microaggressions in the environment that remind people of their body size and trigger their internalized weight stigma, they may actually embody the cultural associations with body size, thereby undermining their own recovery. Next slide, please. Oh, actually, before you do that, there has been some look at how we can prevent this from happening. And some really important things they've learned around race and gender that I think probably apply is that representation within staff and personnel is one of the most important issues. The physical environment and the built environment. So the pictures on the wall, the accessibility of the built environment, being welcoming to the targeted population helps reduce this differential performance. Making clear that diversity is valued in the space and that they are particularly welcomed. Informing people about stereotype threat can be helpful, but it really matters how it's delivered. And so we want to be really careful that we're saying we know that we're all at risk of reproducing stigma within ourselves. And I think this is something we're really used to telling smaller bodied people who are trying to recover from anorexia, that they are internalizing weight stigma. But we're less good about telling that to larger bodied people and then walking the walk. So we tell them not to internalize it, but then we reinforce it in our environments. Next slide, please. Great. I also want to mention, I think it's really important, that fat phobia is really rooted in racism and colonialism and misogyny. And these are not structures that I know any of you want to reproduce in your work. So if we look at fat phobia in American literature and culture, it goes right back to the idea that Black people had animal appetites. They couldn't control their desires to eat and drink and have sex and dance and sort of not participate in the proper American culture. White people, although voluptuousness had been celebrated at other times in our culture, began to be able to control their body size through things they had access to, and then also to control what Black and Indigenous people had access to, taking away their native foods, giving them access to less variety. And so this division in body size became bigger and bigger. It's also really important to realize that there's intersectional impacts. So the incidence of weight bias is just about as high as the incidence of racial bias in our communities, but there are people who suffer from all of them. So Black, women, disabled, poor people are suffering from all of these intersections. And so I want to talk about why that matters beyond just social justice. Next slide. So before we go on, I want to just take a moment, a deep breath, hold ourselves tenderly and think, are we part of this problem inadvertently? So what am I bringing to the room when I'm working with people of larger body size? Do I have some of these ideas about them? And we're more likely to talk with a person in a larger body about impulse control or riding the wave, for example, than I am to talk about those same things in a person in a smaller body. Do I make assumptions about a person's fitness, a person's character, how they got to where they are? How are the larger bodied patients in my practice feeling physically navigating a space? So often I, in a larger body, enter a colleague's space and I can't sit comfortably in a chair. So if I'm uncomfortable in the chair, what sort of stereotype threats are coming up for me? How welcome do I feel in the environment? Are the photos of people who are recovered representing what my recovered body might look like? When I feed and treat larger bodied patients, am I treating their medical condition or am I treating my bias about their size? And if I think honestly about these questions, do the answers reflect my values? And do they reflect scientific evidence? If I'm in a smaller body, how does my privilege affect how I think about these things? Next slide. So a lot of times people are so happy to have a doctor giving this talk because they're like, I get it. I don't want to reinforce diet culture. I don't. And I know the harm on myself and on my patients. But what about health? Like, I can't just let people get fat, can I? So I want to really address this idea of weight and health. And for those of you who are on it, fabulous, but it never hurts to have a review because I know that if you believe this, you're having trouble talking to the doctors that refer patients to you. So I want to remind people that a correlation is not causation, okay? So the fact that people in larger bodies may have certain health problems does not mean that the fat cells themselves cause the health problems. And there's so much evidence about this, it almost hurts to present it. And so one thing I want to offer is don't be afraid to ask physicians for the data supporting their approach, because it's not there. And at some point, it doesn't make sense for us to have to continually prove that what they're saying is wrong when they can't prove that what they're saying is right. But I want to give you some data. So we know that many, many things correlate better with body size than diet and movement do. And a really important one is childhood trauma, okay? As well as poverty, social class, income, race, gender, exposure to environmental toxins. All of these things correlate with body size much better than diet and exercise do. And the thing is that we know that all of those things directly cause heart disease, insulin resistance, depression, high blood pressure, all of the things we attribute to higher body weight. And there was a fabulous study in Britain looking at job class, because it's a very job class society. And middle managers had the strongest risk of metabolic syndrome, regardless of size. And if you account for their job class being middle managers, so people with high responsibility but very low autonomy, only 10% of metabolic syndrome was explained by traditional risk factors. Next slide. Another really important thing is that a lot of the risks we associate with body size are much better attributable to weight cycling. And some of the biggest studies that are reported for showing that body size causes health problems, when their sub-analyses were done, it was actually weight cycling that explained a lot more of it. And so weight cycling is the most predictable outcome of dieting. And when I say dieting, I want to offer that as caloric restriction, because a lot of us underfeed our larger bodied eating disorder clients. That is dieting. Okay? The most reliable outcome of that is increase in eating and weight cycling, which leads to increased cardiovascular death, more cancer, more high blood pressure, more diabetes, and a lot of psychological suffering. Next slide, please. So there's a really important study that I recommend you have in your back pocket if you're communicating with other health professionals, which showed that if we just use body size as a marker of cardiometabolic health, which is what everyone talks about, why we want to combat obesity, quote, nearly half of people classified as overweight by BMI, 30% of people classified as obese by BMI, and even almost 1 in 8 people classified as, quote, morbidly obese are metabolically healthy. And 30% of, quote, normal BMI patients are metabolically unhealthy. So if we use BMI to classify health, tens of millions of Americans are misclassified. And even more so, in one of the largest epidemiological studies ever done, almost 2 million people were followed for 10 years to look at mortality relative to body size. And the highest life expectancy was in people who were classified as overweight by BMI. And people with a BMI between 18 and 20, which is technically normal, had a lower life expectancy than people with a BMI between 34 and 36, which is obese. And this is called the obesity paradox. And it's called that because, even though it's true, it's a paradox, because how can that be true when big people are obviously so sick? Another really important thing to know is that people who are larger may have higher incidences of certain diseases, but they actually fare better with those diseases. So if you're large and you have heart disease, you're more likely to survive. If you're large and you have cancer, you're more likely to survive. If you're large and you have diabetes, for the same level of glucose control, you're more likely to survive. And then lastly, I'll just say one more thing about weight and health, because this comes up so often, is that there are so many things that modify the correlation between weight and health. So a larger person who doesn't smoke, doesn't drink, and eats a moderate amount of fruit and vegetables has exactly the same mortality risk as a smaller person who does those things. All right, next slide. So the problem is that weight stigma does not just lead to dieting, which leads to weight gain, which undermines the whole problem, even if you think fatness is bad. But weight stigma has independent effect on health, separate from body size. So subjected to weight stigma, there are metabolic and physiologic processes that raise blood pressure, cause metabolic syndrome, increase cortisol reactivity, and increase the risk of heart disease and cancer. And Lily O'Hara, who's just so articulate about these things, talks about the adipogenic environment. So if we think about the obesogenic environment that people talk about, that there's something about our culture that's making people fatter. She actually coins this phrase about the fat phobia environment. And she says, in a bitter twist of irony, there's evidence that a direct causal pathway from weight stigma to weight gain, with or without changes in eating behavior as a mediator, which demonstrates that the fat phobic environment is itself an obesogenic environment. A fat hating environment makes people fat and sick. Next slide. So what happens when we're using all these lenses to view our patients is that we miscategorize a lot of our eating disorder patients. So we look at their body and we see that they are sometimes eating large amounts of food, and we label them as having binge eating, when in fact they're binging because they're not getting enough nutrition. Okay, so we miss the diagnosis of atypical anorexia. And then I can't say how many times it has happened that I've sent a very sick patient in anything above a quote ideal body weight to a treatment center and had them come back 6 months later not weighing a pound more than they went in. And they tell me that the classic anorexics were on a minimum exchange diet, but from the very moment they walked in, they were allowed a flexible eating plan and encouraged to just eat to satisfaction, even though they had demonstrated that they did not have a good sense of what satisfaction was for their bodies. Or they were put on an exchange plan, but to a body weight lower than their current body weight, in the hope that they would recover, quote, but not get more fat or recover into a smaller body. Underfeeding someone leads eventually to a physiologic need to eat more. This also, when they see that they're being fed differently, reinforces the idea that they are too fat and triggers that stereotype threat and a sense that they can't control their eating. The other thing is, yeah, I'll just go to the next page. Next slide. Yeah. So I want to just remind you about underfeeding. So if we don't feed someone what they need to maintain the body that they're in now, taking into consideration the oppressive factors they've been under throughout their life, whether it be racial structural oppression, gender structural oppression, cultural structural oppression, poverty, or size, if we underfeed them relative to what their body needs now, we induce a cascade of metabolic processes that drives an unconscious desire to eat and suppresses metabolism and induces starvation physiology in a way that will cause weight rebound. If we set people up for this, when they encounter that strong drive to eat, they won't know what to do and they'll think that they were wrong because of the messages they got under our treatment. Yeah, and I can answer questions about this. This also often comes up. The other thing is that when we create weight goals for people, we often use ideal body weight. The problem is that that just does not apply for individuals. It was designed across populations. When we look at where a larger bodied patient is likely to end up, we need to look at weight trajectory over time, and we need to feed them for where they are now. What happens with larger bodied patients, in smaller bodied patients, we know that we have to weight restore before we do the hard psychological work, because a starving brain cannot be flexible and cannot reflect on values. Yet with larger bodied patients, while we're underfeeding them and before they're nutritionally restored, we often ask them to go into this hard psychological work, which reinforces the idea that they cannot control themselves and they can't do the hard work. An interesting thing is that weight is largely genetically determined. So if we look at things that are genetically determined, like height and heart disease, diabetes, and cancer, weight is second only to height as genetically determined. So we just can't have that much impact on us. We need to respect how body comes to us. Next slide. So for me, there is no way around weight inclusive healthcare, which is about justice. We have to center the experience of the most marginalized people in our care. We have to make sure that our environments are welcoming, that we do not allow microaggressions in feeding, microaggressions in things other people in the milieu say, saying that they feel fat, for example. That just cannot be allowed. We have to prioritize those that are being marginalized within our own treatment centers. We need to treat to people's current body weight given what they come to us. And we need to make sure that we're not prioritizing our concept of health or beauty over what is played out in the data. Next slide. I know doctors reinforce a lot of this. So I want to empower you to tell doctors that you believe and you know that patients can reach their maximal health regardless of body size, but that we know that having their weight suppressed long-term and then rebounding is the biggest potential risk to their health. Empower your patients to request not to be weighed and reach out directly to doctors who are saying that they need the patients to come out weight suppressed. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with all of you, and I look forward to working together in the future and to answering your questions.
Hi, it's Judith. I'm next, but I don't see my video showing up yet.
It's there, Judith. We see you.
Oh, okay, great. Well, thank you, Lynn. It's a pleasure to be here today. And Lisa, that was an awesome presentation. I started working in the field of eating disorders in the late 1980s and was treating binge eating disorder and chronic dieting starting in the 90s. Of course, we didn't have the diagnosis of binge eating disorder yet, but that's what I was doing. And I saw that the clients I treated were able to normalize their eating, to make peace with food. I was using the intuitive eating, or I call it attuned eating framework, and that was very effective. But what I also saw is that in order for people, or that when people walked out into the world, when they left the comfort of their own homes, they were bombarded with weight stigma. It could be from families, from friends, from their doctors. And we all know diet culture, it's everywhere. And so it became very clear to me that as a therapist in this field, I had an obligation not just to sit with my clients in my office, but to figure out how to make a difference, how to fight back against the weight stigma. And I continue to do that when and wherever I can. Next slide, please. So I want to talk about, weight stigma, as Lisa was alluding to, doesn't just exist out in diet culture, it exists in our own profession. So some of the things we hear are things like, we won't let you gain too much weight, or what Lisa referred to, assuming a higher weight client has binge eating disorder or underfeeding a client with atypical anorexia. And I've even heard at, for example, eating disorder conferences, I've heard providers talking about, I can't eat that, it's too fattening. I've heard diet talk. In fact, I was presenting at an organization, an eating disorder organization invited me to do a seminar on weight stigma, and we were doing some experiential work. And one of the therapists very bravely shared that as a higher weight clinician, she was really having a hard time sitting in the lunchroom with everybody because there was some diet talk, good food, bad food talk. And she solved it by removing herself, by just eating in her office, but also felt quite a loss because she couldn't have that connection at lunch. Jennifer Rollin is a therapist in the eating disorder field. You may have heard of her. And she had written a letter to a former therapist. She posted on social media. And with her permission, I just want to share it to you. She said, a note to the first eating disorder therapist I ever saw. It's definitely nuanced that in some ways you helped me. You taught me the principles of self-compassion and how to be kinder to myself, and reminded me that our bodies change as we age. I think you had good intentions, but you just couldn't see what you missed. When you told me, don't worry, I don't let my patients get obese, you reinforced that fat was the worst thing I could be. When you said, you only need to gain about 5 pounds, you made promises that you couldn't keep as my body proceeded to gain more than that, which it needed to be healthy. When you told me later that you didn't believe in health at every size and that obesity killed, I realized you couldn't truly help me heal my body image issues because of your own fat phobia. It would have been so healing to hear wherever your body naturally ends up is perfectly okay, and fat is not something you need to fear. Let's work to unpack and unlearn internalized weight stigma. Next slide, please. So weight stigma is out there everywhere, and as Lisa mentioned, it leads to internalized weight stigma. And this is just really important for us to understand, and I'll be speaking to it more as I go on. But you know, when you think about it, we aren't born thinking one size is better than another. We learn it, and we learn it well, and it leads to body shame, appearance monitoring, decreased psychological well-being, and decreased physical health. Next slide. So I know most of you listening are familiar with binge eating disorder, but bear with me as I go through this for anyone who isn't familiar, but also because I want to make a point about it. So eating more, this is the DSM-5 definition, eating more than most people would in a discrete period of time, a sense of lack of control over eating, eating rapidly, large amounts of foods when not physically hungry, eating until uncomfortably full, eating alone because of embarrassment over eating, and feeling disgusted, depressed, or very guilty after eating. So next slide, please. So why are we talking about weight? When you think about that definition, there's absolutely nothing that requires weight loss to be successful. And yet within the field, there's been so much conversation about, based on the assumption that people with binge eating disorder are in larger bodies, which often they are, but they aren't always, and that weight loss is a goal. So several years ago, I was speaking at a major eating disorder conference on the health at every size approach. And because I was there, I was able to go to some other workshops. And of course, I was drawn to the ones that were on binge eating disorder. And I was really disappointed by what I heard. So I'm going to be sharing some of that with you. Next slide, please. And as I do this, it's not to call out any particular individual, but just to look at some of the ways the thinking can be in the field and then how that hurts the clients we work with. So this first presenter, I had taken some notes, and so I went back to her website afterwards just to kind of find what she had said, and it was there. So there was an assumption that people with binge eating disorder are always at a higher weight, which, like I said, isn't true. And then she talked about a goal to increase willpower muscle and spend that limited power budget wisely, with the idea that, again, to make sure you don't eat too much so you lose weight or don't gain any more weight. Next slide, please. And then went on to talk about developing a realistic weight goal based on genetics and metabolism. Lisa referred to that much of our weight is based on genetics. But that idea that we can develop a realistic weight goal, we don't get to decide. Our bodies decide that. And it's not the conscious process that we've been taught of calories in and calories out. If you can look at the last bullet point, then she says individuals must accept moderate, modest weight loss as a success. If you're familiar with the research, you know that there's not a single program or plan out there that shows sustainable weight loss for the vast majority of people. We know that there are all kinds of diets, programs. These days it's called a wellness program, my wellness plan, that will lead to weight loss in the short term, but we inevitably see weight regained for the majority of people, and often people end up higher than their pre-diet weights. So as clinicians, to set weight loss as a goal to support that is to do harm. Next slide, please. And I guess I want to make one other comment before I talk about this one. The other issue is that it can leave our clients feeling like a failure. So, for example, I work with somebody who has binge eating disorder, and she has now normalized her relationship with food, eats in a way that supports her body, and is physically active in a way that she enjoys. But if we're looking at weight loss, she hasn't lost weight. And so there's a shame for our clients when the expectation is if you want to lose weight, you should be able to. Or part of being cured of binge eating disorder means you'll no longer be at a higher weight. So the second workshop I went to was by researchers. And if you look at the third or the final bullet point here, it says prevention of excess weight gain or modest weight loss when expressed by patients or indicated to improve health outcomes. And I don't want to sound like a broken record, but we've talked about that not being a realistic, an achievable goal, and Lisa spoke to that so well. And I want to mention this other part, when expressed by the patient. You know, at the core of our eating disorder clients, there's a fear of fat. And when people come to me, even though they know I'm not a weight loss program, they're there to treat the eating behaviors, I don't think I've had anybody come in, unless they're already familiar with health at every size, who wasn't hoping to lose weight. And even then, there's often that wish. So because of internalized weight stigma, it's not surprising that our clients want to lose weight. So do we support that, or do we help them understand that that's part of the stigma they've internalized in the culture, and help them figure out how to reject that and how to take care of their body and feel more at home in their body? Next slide, please. Okay, so going down to the third bullet, she said abstinence is associated with long-term weight control. Well, we know that abstinence, when we're looking at binge eating disorder, for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. If we have somebody abstaining, they're eventually going to binge out of it. Provides a good foundation for those in need of weight loss treatment when indicated to improve health outcomes. So again, you know, the framework, the weight management model that you have to lose weight to be healthy. And I'll leave any questions about that for Lisa at the end of our presentation. Next slide, please. So she then talked about, let's see, if modest weight loss is indicated to achieve a positive health outcome, avoid traditional crash dieting with extreme restriction. And then the next bullet says establish regular eating and moderate flexible restraint. So what's happening is that people are realizing dieting doesn't work, but still having a hard time giving up a focus on weight loss in some way. And so this idea of moderate or flexible restraint comes up. Next slide, please. So I want to share with you, this is a study done about intuitive eating versus that flexible restraint or control. This was done by Tracy Tilka and her colleagues, and is from the journal Appetite. And they write that flexible control strategies include monitoring portion sizes, eating smaller amounts, and lower calorie versions of comfort foods, staying within a predetermined calorie range, and self-monitoring weight. Flexible control have been touted by certain scholars as adaptive approaches to eating that stand in contrast to rigid restriction of food intake. This is the first study to compare intuitive eating with flexible control. Results indicate that intuitive eating was found to be related to well-being as well as lower BMI. Intuitive eating is an adaptive and distinct construct from flexible control. Flexible control was found to overlap with rigid control, and the researchers concluded that flexible control eating strategies should not be adopted by health professionals or health organizations. Next slide, please. And so in this final slide of hers, she says, stigma of overweight and obesity is painful and pervasive, both by providers and society at large, and is linked to declines in psychosocial and physical health outcomes, increased risk for health disparities and mortality, healthcare, workplace discrimination, and that sensitivity and acceptance of diverse body sizes should be encouraged by providers and society at large, and programs are needed to reduce weight stigma. So I couldn't agree with that more. It was just the irony of not realizing that what came before promotes weight stigma, as do the terms overweight and obesity in this slide. Next slide, please. So I want to talk about language. I know Lisa alluded to it, and I'm pretty sure Erin will mention it too. But the word obesity it's stigmatizing. I have never met anybody who feels good, who likes the term obese to describe themselves. And you may know that in 2013, the American Medical Association officially declared obesity a disease against the advice of their own scientific advisory board. And so just for example, I was giving a talk to public health nurses on weight stigma. And at the break, one of the women came up to me, one of the participants, and said that at her place of work, she had to have like a wellness exam, and they did blood work, and she's higher weight. And her numbers all came back in the normal range. And they said to her, there must be a mistake. And they made her redo the blood work. And again, it all came back normal. Overweight, as Lisa said, over what weight? In the 1990s, the BMI standards were lowered. So millions of people went to bed at a normal weight and they woke up overweight. So I prefer the term higher weight or larger. It's also important to know that the word fat is used in the size acceptance community, people who are fat positive. It's been reclaimed as an identity, just like the term queer has taken on that positive identity in the LGBTQ community. So you might also think of it as a neutral word. I'm tall, I'm short, I'm thin, I'm fat, that it's just an adjective. I want to make a comment about the ACE scores, the Adverse Childhood Experience scores. For those of you who aren't familiar with them, this has to do with traumas that people experience in childhood are predictive of certain behaviors later in life, so things like early pregnancy or drug use. And one of the things the ACE scores are said to be predictive of is obesity. And what I want to make the comment about is that weight is a characteristic, not a behavior. And what the ACE scores are actually predictive of is binge eating. Because when we say that anybody, that childhood trauma leads to obesity, certainly there are people at higher weights who have experienced trauma, just like there are people at lower weights who experience trauma. But there's this assumption out there often that if somebody's higher weight, they must have had, they're covering up something, they're protecting themselves, that there must be trauma. And when that is, there's no way to get out of that assumption. So we need to understand that the ACE scores are predictive of binge eating as the eating behavior. Next slide, please. It's also important for our treatment centers to look at what messages they're giving. When I first did a similar talk a few years ago, and I just Googled eating disorder centers obesity, all kinds of centers came up. That's no longer true, and it's great to see that, but these two still came up. Eating disorder and weight management center. So what's the message we're giving our eating disorder patients when they're saying it's also a weight management center, that their weight can and should be managed, again, that there's a correct weight that they're supposed to be, integrated efforts to prevent and treat obesity and eating disorders across the lifespan. So obesity being a certain size means you must need to be treated. You couldn't possibly be physically, emotionally healthy. And, as if there's no connection between people developing eating disorders because of this fear of fat. Next slide, please. So this idea of becoming a HAES-informed, a health at every size informed therapist at a treatment center. I say therapist, I really should say mental health professional, dietitian, whatever role that you have. Recognizing, like I said earlier, weight is a characteristic, not a behavior. The behaviors considered eating disorder in thinner people are often prescribed to higher weight people. For example, I had somebody with atypical anorexia who's exercising a couple hours, and people are saying, wow, professionals, wow, that's great, you're exercising. She shouldn't be exercising. All types of eating disorders occur in people of all shapes and sizes. At the same time, people of all shapes and sizes do not necessarily have an eating disorder. You have to talk with someone. You have to interview them before you know. So, and finally, successful recovery from binge eating disorder is not dependent on weight loss. Next slide, please. So, like I said, I've been doing this work for a long time and have been around since the Health at Every Size framework came into being. And what I've learned is there are a lot of myths about health at every size. And I know I haven't gone over the actual tenets, but I think it'll become clear to you as I go through this. And when you receive your handout with all kinds of resources, what I'm going to go through, you will also have that as well. So the first myth, health at every size means that all higher weight people can be healthy. No. HAES means that people of all sizes deserve to pursue and have equal access to strategies and treatments that support their bodies to achieve optimal health as they define it. Health is a continuum. There are people at higher weights who are healthy and those who are not healthy, just as there are people at lower weights who are healthy and those who are not healthy. HAES also acknowledges the role that stigma, bias, and oppression play in a person's health. Next myth, health at every size is against weight loss. Nope. HAES is against the pursuit of weight loss because of the dismal failure rate of diets and the physical and emotional harm that results. HAES encourages people to take care of their bodies. If weight changes occur, it's a side effect rather than the goal. HAES does not use weight loss as a measure of success. It's a weight neutral and weight inclusive approach. And finally, health at every size is only relevant to people at higher weights. Nope. HAES is an important framework for people of all sizes. At its core, HAES is a social justice movement that seeks to end discrimination and oppression for people based on body size. HAES acknowledges that people across the weight spectrum feel the effect of weight stigma, fear of fat, and diet culture. It's a set of principles that can help people take the focus off of weight and instead focus on living their best life as they define it. Next slide, please. So I do a lot of trainings for mental health professionals, and at the core of all of them is asking people to examine their own implicit bias. We have all grown up in diet culture. I know Lisa mentioned having to unlearn her own beliefs. I assume that's true for Erin, certainly true for me. I started out working in the OptiFast program, one of those liquid fast programs back in the 80s, where I believed that weight loss was important. And I've done a lot of work to examine my biases, to unlearn them. Recently, Amy Pershing and I published the Body Positivity Card Deck, and there's a lot about helping people, when we talk about body positivity, we don't mean loving your body all the time, but having a way to respond to beliefs about how your body's supposed to look with self-compassion, with mindfulness. But one of our cards also has to do with helping both professionals who might use this, but even with their own clients, look at their own internalized weight bias. So making assumptions about people based on associations to thin and fat negatively impacts people of all sizes. Move toward letting go of assumptions about health, happiness, success, and character based on weight. So we need to not only do the work for ourselves, but help the people, our clients, look at what they've internalized and how to begin to let that go. Next slide, please. I also want to make a comment about thin and other privileges. And so I'll start by acknowledging my own thin privilege, white privilege. A lot of times people get defensive around the word privilege. We've all heard that word now. It's obviously being talked about a lot, but it doesn't mean you've done anything wrong. It just means you have an unearned advantage. So what are some examples of unearned advantages that come from being thin in our culture? Well, it's easier to buy clothes. It's easier to fit in a plane seat, job discrimination, all kinds of things come up around that. But I think we also have to look as a field where we're at. Overall, obviously not everybody, but we tend to be white, we tend to be thinner. And so how do those privileges impact the work we do as clinicians, impact who we treat? What are we missing? What questions aren't we asking? And who are we not serving? Because we want to make sure that groups that have been marginalized have access to treatment and get the kind of treatment that will support their healing and their recovery. So people who are trans or Black or Indigenous or people of color, people with disabilities, we want to make sure that there's room for everybody and that everybody has a seat at the table. Next slide, please. I just want to come back to this idea that I had a lot to unlearn, but I continue to learn. I am constantly listening to podcasts. I know there's a new podcast out called My Black Body that I'm looking forward to with Jennifer Wilson, who's a dietitian. But I'm always listening to people with lived experience. So this is from Lindy West, who, as you may know, wrote the book Shrilled, and there's also a Hulu TV show based on her book. There's a reason why I prefer fat positivity to body positivity. Fat positivity isn't a subcategory of body positivity, it's a prerequisite. Because without a full reckoning of what it means to honor all bodies unconditionally, body positivity becomes just another thing to fail at, just another impossible gendered expectation. We're supposed to be hot in all the old ways while appearing liberated in the new ones. We're expected to devote ourselves to weight loss as much as our mothers and grandmothers did, while at the same time orchestrating an elaborate cover-up. This modern weight loss is always a byproduct of our wellness practice, an incidental surprise. Next slide, please. So I always encourage people as you work on this, you reflect for yourself, for your organizations, to do it with compassion. We all got here the same way, but we have a responsibility to unlearn. And so in the words of Maya Angelou, do the best you can until you know better. Then when you know better, do better. So thank you very much. I'm going to turn it over to Erin.
Thanks, Judith. That was amazing. And I just want to say a sincere thank you to my panelists. Like, I can't believe I'm presenting. I'm going to pinch myself with Judith and Lisa, two amazing colleagues in our field. And really thanks to ANAD for inviting us and Lynn for organizing all of this. It's been a lot of work. We were all supposed to be together in Chicago a few weeks ago, and unfortunately we're here, but I'm really glad we get to present this. And again, just I'm honored to be here. You can go to the next slide. So as I start talking about some of the things from an RD perspective that are going to be important around weight stigma, I just want to very much similar to Lisa and Judith is acknowledge that I did not come to this work informed in the way I am speaking now, or with the consciousness and the understanding that I have now. I came to this work in the midst of my own struggles with food, and felt like being a dietitian would be a great way to tell people, literally, I thought, like, tell people how to eat. It was a very weight-centric approach, and I spent years working, running a weight loss program while I was working for the VA in Los Angeles, and through that there was a lot of harm done. There was countless vets that I talked to about weight loss and encouraged weight loss and encouraged restrictive eating behaviors when, for many of them, they had underlying eating disorders. And it's something that personally, I wrestle with a lot, but I want to disclose in all honesty that's where I came from, because many of folks who might be listening are also maybe coming from that same perspective, right? Of like trying to unlearn some of these things, and that takes time and it takes a lot of grace. And I'm really thankful for my teachers and mentors before me who were able to hold space for me in this struggle, and also allow for me to sort of explore what this new way of thinking might be and how it could impact me professionally. I also show up with a lot of privileges. Judith was talking about fat acceptance and using the word fat. I identify as fat. I do it for all the reasons that Judith so eloquently already stated. It's my reclamation of the word, and I invite people to use it in their description of me. It's not what everyone in the larger body wants, so I'm not giving you permission to use it with everyone, but it's allowable for me. And also I show up with a lot of privileges around access to education, being able to go back to school at 30 to become a dietitian, there's a lot of privilege around my gender, being cisgender and white in the society. So, all of those things color my experience and bring blinders to my work. And lastly, before I go into any more slides, is for all the dietitians or therapists or doctors or nurses, social workers, all the folks listening who are, maybe hearing this for relatively one of the first times, or it's new to them, is just like Lisa said, like, we want to create a space where you can lean in to some of the discomfort that might come from hearing about some of these things. And again, acknowledging that we've all have done harm in sort of past experiences, and this, that's a very human part of this. So as I go in and just want to, talk about this RD experience, the dietitian experience around weight stigma, I want to start by trying to zoom out pretty wide. Go back a slide if that's okay. Thanks. Is to really think about sort of what is the funnel, right? That dietitians, students are coming through in order to receive this training. There's a lot of privilege in becoming a dietitian. There's a lot of schoolwork. Internships are largely unpaid, and so the product of that is that it's not a very diverse field. And so when earlier we're talking about the necessity for diversity and representation from a clinical standpoint, it's important to understand what are some of those barriers that show up right from the get-go. And so this is why we see so many, there's not a lot of people of color as dietitians. It's a mostly white field. It's a field that's mostly thin bodies, mostly cis female bodies as well. So there's not that a great representation from the field. And I just want to think about, again, partly why that is that many of our undergraduate and graduate programs and internships are really still steeped in diet culture. They are talking about a very weight-centric approach. The training is extremely driven by the assumptions that Lisa and Judith did a great job of breaking down, that health and weight are directly connected, and that this is the intervention that we should be prescribing to all of our clients who are living in larger bodies. There's very little exposure to a counter argument, if you will, to say like, hey, here are the flaws in some of this research, and here are the flaws in some of these assumptions. There are very few internships or programs that even will discuss health at every size, and if they do, it's maybe within the context of another class, but it's not really given a lot of time for folks to learn about. So you have these dietitians, interns, graduates, right, coming into the field with very little exposure to anything grounded in a sort of institutional training that is presenting them a counter argument, where clearly, as we can see just from today's presentation, there is enough data to make a very strong educational program that is rooted from a health at every size or and weight inclusive perspective. And the other part is that we're never ever talking about trauma. We're never exposed to ACEs. I learned about ACEs through my body trust certification, and I can remember the day that I learned about it and how much changed. Actually, I wouldn't say changed, how much it connected in this learning of the impact of weight stigma. And there are virtually no programs that are discussing trauma and ACE scores or social justice issues. And very little, very almost no discussions on the impact of white supremacy and racism and transphobia and fat phobia on health. Next slide. So it's a very weight-centric, it's a very weight-centric training. It's a very science-driven training. It's a very like cause-effect. And here is the equation you need to do this. And I think a lot of that stems from the training that's centered around how dietitians are trained to calculate target body weight. So first off, there are many tools to do this. A lot of us know about BMI, but there's Hamwe equations. I just wrote down some of them. Divine equations, Robinson, Miller, a general target body weight calculation, adjusted body weight, etc. There are all of these different equations. They all give plus or minus a lot of the same numbers. And I think it's really important to look at, like, they all have pitfalls. BMI, we can pick apart for hours, right? The fact that it was a statistical equation created in the 1850s by a mathematician who wanted to stratify body size across white men. And it was sort of dormant for many years until it was sort of resurrected around the 1960s and 70s by the CDC. All of these equations are created by doctors. And almost all of them, as we sort of look at the research, are done based on dosing meds or dosing medication. And so that's a really important part of like how these things come to play. But and especially, right, I don't think that they're diverse, right? They don't take into different body sizes. They don't take into account people of color. They don't take into account gender. They are very cisnormative equations. There are tons of blinders and things that these equations are missing. But the thing that I want to hold on to is that as people learn about them, the impact on dietitians is that we leave school saying, oh, I know where your body should be. I have this equation, right? I know I can put in a couple things. I can put it in my Excel sheet, right? And all of a sudden, boom, I know where your body should be. And that assumption right there is what leads to so much of the weight stigma that occurs in our field. And we sort of sit with this idea, oh, why is the body not there? The equation said it should be there, but it's not there. What's going on? Oh, I need to change something. Oh, maybe I'll change how much they're eating. Maybe I'll give them less, give them more. And we think about this often in eating disorder treatment, right? About where should this body recover? Where in my meal plan creation and in my work, I have this target of where I know I'm going for. And it's a fixed target. And if it doesn't get there, I'm not doing anything wrong. The client must be doing something wrong. So it leads to this really big assumption that, again, creates a lot of stigma. So this quote in here, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but it's by Deb Regard, who's one of the matriarchs of health at every size. And it's really just, it highlights to me so much of why health at every size speaks to me in my work, is because this last sentence is basically saying we can't assume, and I think Judith alluded to this on another slide, we can't assume the number on the scale. There's no way we can do it. The only way, right, a person will get to their quote unquote healthy weight is when they are achieving and doing day-to-day practices that are sustainable in their lives. And to me, I would add choices and practices that come from a place of compassion and non-judgment and curiosity. That's when we know someone gets to their quote unquote healthy weight, and we can't assume it. Next slide. The consequences of this target body weight assumption is that, and again, I'm in some ways restating so much of what Lisa and Judith has said already. But I think dietitians, it's really easy for us to underfeed our clients in larger bodies. It is so easy, and then unless we're being unintentional, it will happen. And again, connecting some dots. Lisa said, this is a eating disorder for our folks that are binging, right? It's not a binging problem. It's a disorder of restriction. And I think as we see folks in treatment who are still engaging in binge behaviors, my first question is, this meal plan's not big enough, because they're probably still hungry. They haven't yet developed like that sort of like what Judith is mentioning, right? This ability to build those intuitive eating skills because they've been restricting so long. So how can we make a meal plan and get comfortable with making a meal plan that is adequate to feed someone and even refeed someone in a larger body? What we see, and as we do that, is for a lot of folks, and again, working in a treatment center, I see this firsthand, and it's part of the things we're working on in doing better, is what is that, what is the consequence when someone, how weight stigma shows up when people are sitting down at the table with two vastly different plates, and how staff can handle that, right? Go back one slide, if that's okay. I just want to finish up there. Thanks. The other subsequent parts of this is assuming when weight changes and we can't attribute why, we assume the client's wrong. And I think the weight stigma has this underlying way of showing up where, again, it creates this power differential, right? My equation said you should be here. My meal plan based on these numbers says you should be here. Why are you going there? When maybe that's exactly where their body needs to be. But we assume because they're in a larger body and they're gaining weight that they must be non-compliant. Where's the truth? And that's, again, that simple, not so simple, that moment is what creates this breakdown of a therapeutic relationship where clients feel judged. Oh, my body's wrong. My dietitian said this number, these are the right numbers. I must be doing something wrong. And ultimately, the potential is that it leads to less care with our patients and clients. And Puel does a very good job of highlighting all of that. Next slide. We touched on weight stigma and that, Lisa touched on it, that, dietitians and doctors are definitely showing up and perpetuating weight stigma. The hard part is that we need to actually look inward to our community and our eating disorder community. Puel does research around all different sorts of professions and weight stigma, and when she did research about the eating disorder community, this you can see the results on your screen of how weight stigma shows up and how pervasive it is. And I'm actually going to bring up the last line of this, is that I think the more, I guess, sad data from this study is that there was an over 50% dropout rate as questions in Puel's questionnaire got harder. And it was her highest dropout rate of any profession. So why is that? Why is it in a field that should be leaning in and able and comfortable with the discussion around weight stigma, why are we opting out and dropping out of the questionnaire when it's getting too hard for us? That's where our work needs to really hold on to. Next slide. And we are really, really seeing it now too. In the midst of COVID, we see weight stigma like, in very tangible ways. This came out relatively early in the COVID pandemic, and they asked 900 young adults. 46% of women and 46% of men agreed that it would be worse to gain 25 pounds during social distancing than become infected with COVID. I see this, I read it, and I think, wow, people would rather get COVID and deal with all of the risk of death, long-term complications, than be fat and look like me. We also see it in all of the media reports around how weight is a risk factor. I'm going to go back. Weight is not the risk factor. The risk factor is the resulting health complications associated with weight stigma. The fact that and a broken healthcare system that treats people who, based on socioeconomic status, with different access. You have different access based on your finances. Next slide. And I'm just looking at time, so I'm going to sort of go through these last few a little quicker. But this is, this all stems from this idea of healthism. And again, Lisa and Judith brought up this idea of healthism, but it's this idea that just to sort of go a little bit deeper, it's this idea that if I'm alive, part of the responsibility of being alive is always working towards good health. That it's like a moral imperative, and it assumes weight and health are directly connected, and it ignores all the other social determinants of health that exist in our world, including genetics, including trauma, including weight stigma, including institutional racism, transphobia, fat phobia. It ignores the impact of all of those things and says, really, if you just eat less and move more, you'll be fine and you'll be healthy. And it's so untrue, because all it does is perpetuate the stigma and perpetuate the internalized weight stigma the individual has, that my body's broken. I can't do this. I'm not strong enough. Next slide. Weight does not equal health. We really need to part of unpacking our own bias, part of unpacking our bias so much is this. We need to dismantle the idea that health and is a barometer for worthiness, like Reagan Chastain says. Health is not guaranteed. So much, this is the scary part. So much of our health is out of our control. We can do the best we can, right? So as a dietitian, right, holding on to this, right, and sort of coming to terms that, like, wow, I can't fix everyone. I can have some knowledge around food and nutrition and body systems and counseling skills, but I can't fix everyone. It moves into this idea of thinking about those calculations, right? Thinking about all the things we learn and working with our clients. I'm of the opinion it's more art than science. And what I mean by that, it's more showing up in the room, being human, allowing our clients to share their lived experience for them to feel seen. And yeah, that science stuff is important, and we filter it through a lens of weight stigma, but I think the humanity and the connection that comes from being seen is essential to someone's healing in their eating disorder recovery. Next slide. So again, some of these things have already been said, but I just, some take homes from my perspective is, as a profession, as individuals, we have to name weight stigma. And we name it not just for our clients in larger bodies, we name it for all bodies. I think it's important for all of us to acknowledge privileges as we work with clients. If you're a dietitian in a smaller body, it's okay to acknowledge the thin privilege that you have. And to acknowledge that, hey, this might be a bias in how I see things, but I'm doing my work outside to sort of work on those and heal those. It's not your job to educate me. Most of all, especially for dietitians, right? I know maybe therapists, or maybe it's a little bit easier. I'm not sure about doctors. Lisa, you can answer that. Is we need to get comfortable with uncomfortable conversations. We need to like lean in to that, like some of these things we bring up are going to be really challenging for us and for our clients. But how do we hold space for that? Again, bringing our own humanity into the room. Eating disorders are a social justice issue, just like we've talked about. There are deep societal roots in eating disorders. We have to name them. And like folks have already said, think about your language. It's so important when you think about the language you're presenting to your clients on your website. You know, clients see those, and they it helps them when you use non-stigmatizing language. It helps them show up authentically, and they can do the work safely with you. And I love, how other folks already mentioned, but like, what artwork do you have up? What bodies are you celebrating? What magazines do you have in the waiting room? All those things are really important. I had one client come into my office when I was seeing people in person, and I knew I hit it on the head because they said, wow, this is like the first office I've been to, right, when I was in your waiting room or in your office, that I could sit in any chair and it didn't matter. Like, I felt safe anywhere I sat. And for me, that was like, great. I felt like that's validation, like I did it. So again, we brought up a lot of stuff. Next slide. We'd love to hear, I know we have a little bit of time for questions. I really appreciate you all listening, and hearing some of these, all of these thoughts that we're sharing. So I'm going to turn it over to Lynn, and if she wants to filter some questions in, I'm more than happy. We are all happy to answer.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, and thank you all so much for, thank you to all of the panelists today who brought up so many great and powerful takeaways and just modes of thinking, and really a paradigm shift, as one of our attendees pointed out after Dr. Lisa spoke. We are running a little short on time, so I wanted to pose one summary question for potentially any or all of you to answer. We did get some other questions, but to all of our attendees this afternoon, you'll receive a handout with all of our speakers' contact information, and you can feel free to follow up with them individually. And so the summary question I have for each of you or any of you is basically, if we have listeners today who have experienced an epiphany of sorts, and recognize that they probably have done some harm to their patients, and they now want to do better, what advice do you have for making that transition with some of their current patients on whom they may have already done some harm?
That's a powerful question. And I guess we've all been there.
Yeah.
And so I think about being able to be authentic and being able to say to the client, we, in our work together, I've been talking with you about this, but I have to tell you, I've been doing more learning. I attended this amazing webinar, and I realized there's some different ways to look at it. And I just want to share with you what I've learned and see what you think about us looking at what you've brought in from a different angle. Is that something that you'd feel comfortable with us doing? So that's my initial thought.
I don't think I could say it better than that, Judith, thank you. And I would just add that where a physician is involved and perhaps problematic, you can offer to reach out to that physician and start a conversation. And I am always happy to help provide wording or support for those conversations.
And the one piece I would add is, as the clinician, I think it's really important to look at feedback as a gift, and that when clients do share something that you might have done that's hurtful or has caused harm, is to really see that feedback as a gift, and that, you know, when not getting defensive, not trying to like justify in any way, but just saying, you know, I'm so thankful that you shared this, that like you were vulnerable enough to share this with me. And I take it really seriously, and I'm doing my own work in these ways to try to not do that harm any further. And I'm working on it.
Those are all such great answers, and really a reminder that all of us, even trained professionals, are only human, and we are all learning as we go. So we can all be gentle and give ourselves grace, as Lisa pointed out at the beginning. So I know that Judith wanted to do a very quick closing activity. Judith, that we're not going to screen share at this point because our tech person is getting something else ready. But if you could just say what the activity is.
We had a last slide that has an image of compassion and resist. And it really just speaks to what that last question was. Have compassion for yourself, for how you got to where you are, what you were taught, but then resist diet culture and resist the weight stigma so that you can make the shift. And I wanted to share a quote from a client of mine who's in the process of doing this work, because she just said this came out of her mouth. I got permission, and it was just so beautiful. She said, I'm a fat woman with fat phobia. Diet culture taught me this without my permission. It's not my fault, but it's my responsibility to unlearn. So I think that speaks to all of us. And what we want to invite you to do then is, using the chat function, just share with us one action you would like to take as a result of hearing what we've talked about today. So we'll stick around. I'm going to open the chat. Everybody should have it. And if people are willing to share, I can read some of them back or not. But Lynn, thank you again for for inviting us and having this panel here today. It was really been a pleasure.
Yeah.
Thank you all for being here.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so I'm seeing some coming. Quit weighing myself daily.
Yeah, thank you.
Plan to learn more about HAES on Facebook.
Thank you for the chairs.
Got the
Yeah.
chairs. So we love seeing these come in.
Yeah, and I'm sure the epiphanies will keep clicking as this marinates and you sleep on it and think about what to do next with what you've learned today. The recording will be sent out this afternoon. Evaluation will be sent out tomorrow, and we should have coming up, our tech person is going to post some information on now. Yep, there it is. So to all attendees who are interested in going into a small group discussion, just simply click on this link, and we have some clinicians from our sponsoring treatment centers who will be leading some discussions about what we've all learned today. So thank you again for all the attendees who came, and especially to our speakers, for so much wisdom, perspective, and vulnerability in sharing this information. And we really appreciate that. And thank you to our sponsors. Hey everyone, we'll see you here same time next week for our second webinar on men with eating disorders. So tune in for that. Thank you again, everyone. See you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.